The day I made my boss regret every word. You know what the beautiful thing about revenge is? It's not the moment you strike back. It's watching someone realize they've been playing chess while you've been playing 4D warfare. That's what I told myself as I sat in conference room B, watching my boss Richard Blackstone shuffle through his presentation notes with the same arrogant smirk he'd worn for the past 18 months. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank you all for watching. Please do not forget to like, subscribe and share. It helps us in creating these videos and building this wonderful community. Now let us dive in. My name is Cassandra Blake, and this is the story of how I turned the tables on the man who tried to destroy my career and my confidence. One condescending comment at a time. It started innocently enough. Well, as innocent as corporate politics can be. I'd landed what I thought was my dream job at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, a mid-sized firm that handled accounts for some pretty impressive clients. The salary was decent. The office had those trendy exposed brick walls that made you feel like you were part of something important, and my interview had gone so well that I practically floated home. But dreams have a funny way of turning into nightmares when you're not paying attention. Richard Blackstone was the kind of man who wore his MBA from a second-tier business school like it was a crown. 40-something with prematurely gray hair that he probably thought made him look distinguished, and a handshake that lasted just a beat too long. The kind that said, "I'm establishing dominance," rather than "nice to meet you." From day one, he made it clear that he viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenience wrapped in business casual. "Cassandra," he'd say during our first team meeting, drawing out my name like it physically pained him to pronounce it. "I hope you understand that we maintain very high standards here. I'd hate for you to feel overwhelmed." The way he said overwhelmed made it sound like a medical condition I might catch from breathing the same air as the rest of the team. I should have recognized it as the first shot across the bow, but I was still in that optimistic new employee phase where you assume everyone wants you to succeed. How naive I was. The real campaign began about 3 weeks into my employment. It was subtle at first. The kind of psychological warfare that's almost impossible to prove because it lives in tone and implication rather than outright aggression. "Are you sure you understand the client's needs?" he'd ask during project briefings, his voice dripping with false concern. "This is quite complex. Maybe someone with more experience should take the lead." Or my personal favorite, "I know this might be challenging for someone at your level, but do try to keep up." He had this way of pausing before words like level or background or experience that made them sound like polite substitutes for incompetence. It was masterful, really. If you called him out on it, he could always claim he was just being helpful, just looking out for the team's best interests. The rest of my colleagues, Jennifer, Mike, and David, watched these exchanges with a kind of uncomfortable silence that said they were grateful it wasn't happening to them. I couldn't blame them entirely. Corporate environments have a way of turning decent people into cowards when their own job security might be at risk. But it wasn't just the words. Richard had elevated undermining to an art form. He'd schedule important meetings and forget to invite me, then act surprised when I wasn't up to speed on decisions that directly affected my projects. He'd reassign my biggest accounts to other team members with a casual, "I just want to make sure our clients get the attention they deserve." He'd edit my reports so heavily that they barely resembled my original work, then present them to upper management as examples of how the team was collaborating to achieve excellence. The worst part wasn't even the professional sabotage. It was how he made me doubt myself. After 6 months of constant questioning, second-guessing, and thinly veiled insults, I started wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I had oversold my abilities during the interview. Maybe I really was as incompetent as his tone suggested. I'd go home to my small apartment and stare at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Why couldn't I seem to do anything right? Why did every idea I presented get shot down? Why did I feel like I was constantly walking on eggshells around someone who was supposed to be mentoring me? The breaking point came during our quarterly client review meeting with Meridian Industries, one of our biggest accounts. I'd spent weeks preparing a comprehensive analysis of their marketing performance, and had developed what I genuinely believed was an innovative strategy for their Q4 campaign. Richard barely glanced at my presentation before the meeting. "I'm sure it's adequate," he said, the word adequate hanging in the air like a bad smell. "But I think it might be better if I handle the strategic components. You can cover the basic metrics." Basic metrics. Like I was a first-year intern whose greatest skill was reading numbers off a spreadsheet. The client meeting was a disaster, but not for the reasons Richard expected. When it came time to present my basic metrics, I decided to go off script. Instead of just reciting performance numbers, I started explaining the patterns I'd identified, the market trends I'd researched, and the strategic opportunities I'd uncovered. Mr. Harrison, Meridian's CMO, leaned forward in his chair. "That's fascinating, Cassandra. Can you elaborate on the demographic shift analysis?" I could see Richard's jaw tighten as I launched into a detailed explanation of consumer behavior patterns that I'd spent hours researching. This wasn't in his presentation. This wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated show where he played the brilliant strategist and I played the supporting role. "Where did you find this data?" Mrs. Chen, their brand manager, asked with genuine interest. I cross-referenced several industry reports with our campaign performance data and identified some correlation patterns that might explain the engagement dips we've been seeing, I replied, pulling up additional slides I'd prepared but hadn't planned to use. For 20 minutes, I held the room's attention while Richard sat there with the expression of someone watching their carefully laid plans unravel in real time. The clients asked follow-up questions, took notes, and actually seemed excited about the insights I was sharing. As we walked back to the office afterward, Richard was unusually quiet. I should have known he was planning his counterstrike. The next morning, he called me into his office with that fake friendly smile that had become as familiar as my morning coffee. "Cassandra, we need to talk about yesterday's meeting," he began, settling behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "I have to say, I was quite surprised by your improvisation." "The clients seemed engaged," I replied carefully. "Oh, they were definitely surprised," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "But surprise isn't always a good thing in client relations. Professional presentations require structure, preparation, and most importantly, approval from the team lead." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him like he was about to deliver profound wisdom. "I think what happened yesterday really highlights some fundamental gaps in your understanding of client management. The clients were polite, of course, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. They're used to a certain level of strategic thinking from our team, and I'm not sure your approach met those expectations." I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, that sick feeling I'd grown to associate with these conversations. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the memory of how engaged the clients had actually been, or maybe I was just tired of being gaslit into thinking my successes were failures. "Richard," I said slowly, "are you suggesting that the client's positive response was actually negative?" His smile became sharper. "Cassandra, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Your inability to read professional situations accurately. It's concerning and frankly, it's something we need to address before it impacts the team's reputation with our clients." That's when he dropped the bomb. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I believe it would be beneficial for everyone if we restructured your role. Something more suited to your skill set. Maybe research support or administrative coordination. Behind-the-scenes work where attention to detail matters more than strategic thinking. Behind-the-scenes work. Administrative coordination. In other words, a demotion wrapped in corporate speak. I want you to think about it over the weekend," he continued, his tone now dripping with false concern. "I know it might feel like a step back, but sometimes we need to be honest about our limitations. There's no shame in finding the right fit." I walked out of his office in a daze, his words echoing in my head. Limitations, right fit, behind-the-scenes work. That weekend was one of the longest of my life. I barely left my apartment, alternating between righteous anger and crushing self-doubt. Was he right? Had I misread the client meeting entirely? Maybe my presentation really had been as amateurish as he suggested. Saturday morning, I called my best friend Maya, who worked in marketing for a tech startup in San Francisco. I needed an outside perspective from someone who understood the industry but didn't have any connection to Pinnacle. "Let me get this straight," Maya said after I'd recounted the entire situation. "The clients were engaged, asking follow-up questions, taking notes, and seemed genuinely interested in your analysis?" "Yes, but Richard says I misread their reactions. He says they were just being polite." Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. Not at me, but with the kind of bitter recognition that comes from experience. "Cass, I've been in this industry for 8 years. Clients don't ask 20 minutes of follow-up questions just to be polite. They don't take notes on presentations they think are amateur hour. And they definitely don't seem excited about insights they find confusing or inappropriate." "But what if?" "No," she interrupted firmly. "What if nothing? You know what this sounds like? This sounds like a manager who's been undermining you for months and panicked when you actually shined in front of clients. He's gaslighting you into thinking your success was actually failure." The word gaslighting hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard the term before, but I'd never applied it to my own situation. The systematic undermining of my confidence, making me question my own perceptions and abilities, convincing me that my strengths were actually weaknesses. It was textbook psychological manipulation. "Maya," I said slowly, "I think I need to document everything that's happened since I started this job." "Now you're thinking strategically," she replied. "And Cass, start looking for other perspectives on your work. If this guy has been messing with your head for months, you need external validation to remember what you're actually capable of." After we hung up, I spent the rest of Saturday creating a detailed timeline of every interaction I'd had with Richard. Every undermining comment, every reassigned project, every meeting I'd been excluded from, every time he'd edited my work beyond recognition. Seeing it all laid out chronologically was shocking. The pattern was so clear and so consistent that it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or well-intentioned management. But Maya's advice about seeking external validation stuck with me. Sunday morning, I did something I'd never done before. I reached out to former colleagues from my previous job to ask their opinion about some of the work I'd done at Pinnacle. I sent carefully worded emails to 3 people I'd worked with at my last company, asking if they'd be willing to review some market analysis I'd done and give me feedback. I framed it as wanting to improve my analytical skills, not as seeking validation, but I desperately needed to know if my work was actually as flawed as Richard suggested. The responses I got were eye-opening. "Cass, this demographic analysis is incredibly thorough," wrote Tom, a senior analyst I'd respected enormously. "The methodology is solid, the data sources are appropriate, and the insights are genuinely valuable. Whoever you're working with should be thrilled to have this level of analysis on their team." Jessica, a former manager, was even more direct. "This is some of the best market research I've seen in years. The client who received this presentation got tremendous value. Are you sure your current manager understands strategic analysis? Because if he's not recognizing this quality of work, that says more about his capabilities than yours." By Sunday evening, I had 3 independent confirmations that my work was not only competent but exceptional. Armed with that external validation, I felt ready to dig deeper into what was really happening at Pinnacle. That's when I started scrolling through LinkedIn and found the post that changed everything. Meridian Industries had posted about their Q3 marketing review, and there, in the comments, was a response from Mr. Harrison himself. "Excellent insights from the Pinnacle team, particularly the demographic trend analysis. Looking forward to implementing these strategies in Q4. I screenshotted the comment and stared at it for a long time. The demographic trend analysis. My work. The work that Richard had dismissed as confusing and inappropriate for the client. The work that had supposedly demonstrated my fundamental lack of understanding about client management. The client loved it. They were planning to implement my strategies. They had specifically called out my analysis as excellent. Richard had lied to me. Completely, deliberately, maliciously lied. The anger that washed over me was different from anything I'd felt before. It wasn't the hot, impulsive rage of someone who's been insulted. It was cold, calculating fury. The kind of anger that sharpens your focus rather than clouding it. If Richard wanted to play games with my career and my confidence, fine. But he'd made a critical mistake. He'd assumed I was too naive or too intimidated to verify his version of events. He'd underestimated my ability to think strategically about more than just marketing campaigns. That's when I started digging deeper into Richard Blackstone himself. It turns out that when you're properly motivated, you can learn quite a lot about a person from public records and professional networks. Richard's LinkedIn profile was a masterclass in creative embellishment. That senior strategy director position he'd held before Pinnacle lasted 8 months. The award-winning campaign he always referenced. I couldn't find any evidence it had actually won anything. I spent hours cross-referencing his employment history with industry publications, press releases, and professional awards databases. The more I dug, the more discrepancies I found. He'd claimed to have led strategic initiatives at companies where public records showed he'd held junior analyst positions. He'd taken credit for campaign results that had actually been achieved by teams he'd briefly worked with rather than managed. But the real revelation came when I started looking at Glassdoor reviews for his previous employers. I filtered the reviews by date ranges that corresponded to Richard's tenure at each company, looking for any mentions of management issues or workplace dynamics. What I found made my stomach turn. Management plays favorites and undermines employees who show initiative, read one review from his previous company. Particularly toxic toward younger staff members who might outshine senior team members. Another. Beware of managers who take credit for your work and then find ways to make you look incompetent when you start to succeed. And then there was this one. If you're a woman in this department, prepare to have your contributions minimized and your competence questioned at every turn. I watched 3 talented women get pushed into better fit roles while less qualified men got promotions. The patterns were unmistakable. Different companies, different time frames, but the same stories of undermining, credit stealing, and systematic confidence destruction. More importantly, I found something that made my blood run cold and my determination crystallize into something sharp and focused. Through a former colleague's LinkedIn post about workplace lessons learned, I discovered the name of someone who had worked directly under Richard at his previous company. Sarah Chen, now a successful marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, had posted a thoughtful piece about overcoming imposter syndrome and toxic management. I sent her a carefully worded message, introducing myself as someone currently working with Richard and asking if she'd be willing to share her experience working in his department. I was honest about my situation without being explicitly negative about Richard. Her response came within hours, and it was longer and more detailed than I had expected. "Cassandra," she wrote, "I'm so glad you reached out, and I hope you don't mind me being direct. Working under Richard Blackstone was one of the most challenging periods of my career, but not for the reasons you might think. Richard has a very specific pattern of behavior that I now recognize as classic workplace bullying disguised as performance management." She went on to describe experiences that were so similar to mine they could have been copied from my journal. The constant questioning of competence, the reassignment of successful projects, the isolation from important meetings, the systematic erosion of confidence through 1,000 small cuts. "The most insidious part," she continued, "is how he makes you complicit in your own undermining. He's so skilled at making you doubt yourself that you start to believe his assessment of your abilities. I spent 6 months thinking I was terrible at my job before I realized that my performance reviews at previous companies had all been excellent." But then she shared something that made me sit up straighter. The thing that finally opened my eyes was when I discovered that he'd been taking credit for a campaign strategy I'd developed. I only found out because the client contacted me directly to congratulate me on the innovative approach. That's when I realized that Richard's assessment of my work as adequate but not strategic was completely disconnected from how our actual clients perceived my contributions. She concluded with advice that felt like a lifeline. Document everything, seek external validation of your work, and remember that his opinion of your capabilities doesn't determine your actual worth or potential. The fact that you're reaching out to get perspective tells me you're already thinking more strategically than he gives you credit for. Armed with this confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, I began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what I was dealing with. Richard wasn't just a demanding boss or even an incompetent manager. He was someone who deliberately undermined talented team members to make himself look better by comparison. More importantly, I found something that made my blood run cold and my determination crystallize into something sharp and focused. Richard had a pattern. Through mutual connections and industry forums, I pieced together stories from his previous positions. There was always someone, usually a younger employee, often a woman, who had been restructured or transitioned to a role better suited to their skill set. People who had started strong but mysteriously developed performance issues that coincidentally aligned with Richard's assessment periods. I wasn't his first victim. I was just the latest in a long line of careers he'd tried to derail to make himself look better by comparison. That realization changed everything. Monday morning, I walked into the office with a plan that had been forming in my mind all night. Richard wanted to play games. Fine. But he'd been playing checkers while I was about to introduce him to chess. But first I needed to understand the broader dynamics at Pinnacle. If Richard had been using these tactics successfully for 18 months, there had to be a reason why upper management hadn't noticed or intervened. I started paying closer attention to how Richard managed up versus how he managed down. In meetings with Elena Martinez, our department head, he was deferential, collaborative, and quick to share credit. He positioned himself as a team builder who was dedicated to developing talent and achieving collective success. "Elena, I'm really proud of how the team has been growing," I overheard him say during one of their weekly check-ins. "Everyone is contributing at their highest level, and I think our mentorship and development programs are really paying off." It was masterful manipulation. He was building a reputation as an effective leader while systematically undermining the very people whose success would validate that reputation. But I also noticed something else. Richard was careful to never criticize team members in front of Elena. His undermining was always done privately, in one-on-one conversations or team meetings where no senior leadership was present. To anyone above his level, we all appeared to be thriving under his management. This realization changed my approach entirely. I couldn't simply document Richard's behavior and present it to leadership, because from their perspective, he was a successful manager overseeing a productive team. I needed to demonstrate the disconnect between his assessment of my capabilities and my actual performance in a way that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. The first move was subtle. During our weekly team meeting, when Richard presented the Meridian account update, I noticed he'd incorporated several of my insights from the client meeting, without attribution, of course. "That demographic shift analysis is really compelling," Jennifer commented. "Where did that research come from?" Richard straightened in his chair, preparing to take credit, but I spoke first. "Actually, I'd be happy to share the methodology with everyone," I said with a bright smile. "I developed it specifically for the Meridian account, and I think it could be applicable to several of our other clients." The room turned to look at me, then back at Richard, whose smile had become slightly strained. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Cassandra did contribute to the research phase." Contributed? Like I was a research assistant rather than the person who had developed the entire analytical framework. But I just nodded and smiled, making a note to myself. Strike one. Over the next few days, I began implementing what I privately called strategic documentation. Every interaction with Richard, every project discussion, every piece of feedback was carefully noted with dates, times, and direct quotes where possible. But more importantly, I started creating paper trails that would be visible to others. When Richard gave me feedback on a project, I followed up with email summarizing our conversation. "Hi Richard, just wanted to confirm my understanding of our discussion about the Morrison Industries proposal. You mentioned that the strategic analysis section needs to be more sophisticated and that I should focus on basic metrics rather than market positioning insights. I'll revise accordingly and have a new draft to you by Thursday. When he reassigned one of my projects to David, I sent a team email. Hi everyone, just wanted to let you know that Richard has decided to have David take the lead on the Zenith campaign strategy. I'll be transitioning all my research and initial analysis to him. David, I'm happy to schedule time to walk through the market segmentation work I've completed if that would be helpful. Each email was professional, collaborative, and completely factual. But they also created a record of Richard's management decisions that others could see and evaluate. The second move came later that week. Richard had scheduled a meeting with upper management to discuss team restructuring and role optimization. Corporate speak for. Let me explain why Cassandra needs to be demoted. What he didn't know was that I'd spent my lunch breaks having coffee with Patricia from HR. Not because I was planning to file a complaint, at least not yet. But because Patricia had been with the company for 12 years and had some fascinating insights about management patterns and employee development. You know, she'd mentioned during one of our conversations, it's interesting how different managers handle underperforming team members. Some focus on additional training and support, others go straight to role changes. Both approaches have their place, of course. That casual comment had planted a seed. The morning of Richard's restructuring meeting, I sent a carefully crafted email to Patricia, copying our department head, Elena Martinez. Subject: Request for professional development resources. Hi Patricia. I hope you're well. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about professional development opportunities. Given some recent feedback about areas for improvement in my current role, I'd love to explore what training resources or mentorship programs might be available to help me build the strategic thinking skills that seem to be a gap in my current performance. I'm particularly interested in any workshops on client presentation skills or advanced market analysis techniques. I want to make sure I'm maximizing my potential contribution to the team. I know Richard is meeting with leadership today to discuss team development, so I thought this might be good timing to explore growth opportunities rather than just focusing on role changes. Best regards, Cassandra. Was perfect, proactive, professional, and subtly highlighting that Richard had been discussing role changes rather than development opportunities. The kind of email that would make HR take notice of a manager who was looking to shuffle problems around rather than solve them. 20 minutes after I sent it, Elena stopped by my desk. Cassandra, could we chat for a few minutes? I'd love to hear more about your interest in professional development. Strike 2. But the real masterpiece was still to come. 2 weeks later, Richard announced that he'd scheduled a presentation for our department to showcase our Q3 performance to the executive team. It was an opportunity for us to demonstrate our strategic thinking and analytical capabilities to the C-suite. Exactly the kind of high-visibility meeting that could make or break careers. I'll be presenting the overall department performance, Richard announced during our team meeting. Jennifer will cover client retention metrics, Mike will handle campaign performance analysis, and David will present our Q4 strategic outlook. He paused, looking directly at me with that familiar condescending smile. Cassandra, I think it would be best if you focused on supporting the team with research and logistics for this presentation. Make sure everyone has the data they need, coordinate with AV for equipment setup, that sort of thing. Research and logistics. Support role. Behind-the-scenes work. Actually, I said, maintaining steady eye contact, I'd love the opportunity to present my demographic trend analysis. The one that Meridian found so valuable. Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure that would be appropriate for this audience, Cassandra. The executive team expects a certain level of strategic sophistication. There it was, in front of the entire team. The implication that I lacked the sophistication for executive-level presentation. Of course, I replied with a smile that matched his. Whatever you think is best. But inside I was already 3 moves ahead. That night, I worked until 2 a.m. putting together the most comprehensive analysis of our department's performance that had ever been compiled. Not just surface-level metrics and pretty charts. A deep dive into market trends, competitive positioning, client behavior patterns, and strategic opportunities that went far beyond anything Richard had ever presented. I cross-referenced industry data, analyzed competitor campaigns, identified emerging market segments, and developed predictive models for client growth potential. It was the kind of work that would typically take a team of analysts weeks to complete. The morning of the presentation, I arrived early and quietly set up my laptop at the back of the conference room. When the executives arrived, CEO Harrison Kim, CFO Linda Rodriguez, and VP of Operations James Chen, I introduced myself and mentioned that I'd prepared some supplementary analysis if there was interest in diving deeper into any of the topics. "Always good to have backup," CEO Kim replied with an approving nod. Richard's presentation was exactly what I'd expected. Competent but unremarkable. Lots of colorful charts showing that we'd met our targets, some generic observations about market conditions, and vague promises about leveraging synergies in Q4. Jennifer, Mike, and David delivered their sections professionally, sticking to the safe, surface-level analysis that Richard preferred. They hit their marks, showed the expected metrics, and sat down to polite applause. Then CEO Kim asked the question I'd been hoping for. "This is all very solid work, team. But I'm curious about the strategic implications of these numbers. What are we seeing in terms of emerging trends or market shifts that might impact our approach going forward?" Richard cleared his throat and launched into a generic response about staying agile and monitoring market conditions. It was the kind of non-answer that sounded professional but said absolutely nothing. After he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then VP Chen spoke up. "Cassandra, you mentioned you had some additional analysis. Would you mind sharing your perspective on market trends?" I could feel Richard's eyes burning into me as I stood up, but I kept my expression neutral and professional. "I'd be happy to share what I've found," I said, moving to the front of the room. What happened next was 18 months of frustration, research, and preparation distilled into 25 minutes of the most focused, comprehensive market analysis that Conference Room had ever seen. I started with the demographic trends I'd identified for Meridian, but then expanded to show how those same patterns were appearing across our entire client portfolio. I demonstrated how changes in consumer behavior were creating new opportunities in markets we'd previously overlooked. I presented predictive models showing which of our current clients were most likely to expand their budgets and which were at risk of reducing spend. But the real revelation came when I started talking about competitive analysis. "One pattern I've noticed," I said, pulling up a slide that showed our performance relative to 3 key competitors, "is that we're consistently stronger in client retention but weaker in new client acquisition." When I dug into the data, I found something interesting. The room was completely silent except for the soft clicking of my presentation remote. Our competitors are targeting demographic segments that we've been largely ignoring. Specifically, there's a growing segment of mid-sized companies in the tech and healthcare sectors that are increasing their marketing spend but aren't finding partners who understand their unique positioning challenges. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed analysis of this untapped market segment. Based on my analysis, there's approximately $2.3 million in potential new business from companies that match our service capabilities but aren't currently served by any of our main competitors. The barrier to entry is low because it requires understanding regulatory compliance in healthcare marketing and technical product positioning, areas where our existing expertise could be leveraged with minimal additional investment. CEO Kim leaned forward. "How confident are you in these numbers?" "I've identified 17 specific companies that match the profile, researched their current marketing spend through public filings and industry reports, and mapped their pain points against our service offerings. I'd say I'm 85% confident in the revenue potential estimate." CFO Rodriguez was taking notes. "What kind of investment would we need to effectively target this segment?" For the next 10 minutes, I walked through a detailed implementation plan that I'd spent weeks developing. Staffing requirements, timeline, expected ROI, risk factors, competitive advantages. Everything they needed to make a strategic decision. When I finished, the room was quiet for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Then CEO Kim started asking questions. Real questions. Strategic questions. The kind of questions you ask when you're genuinely impressed and want to understand how to move forward. How long would you estimate the sales cycle for these types of clients? What regulatory compliance expertise would we need to develop? Are there any existing team members who could transition into this market focus? For 20 minutes, I fielded questions from the C-suite while Richard sat in his chair looking like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using finger paints. When the questions finally stopped, CEO Kim looked around the room. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need to drive growth in the next fiscal year. Cassandra, I'd like you to develop a detailed business plan for this market expansion. Can you have something ready for review by the end of next week? Absolutely, I replied, trying to keep the triumph out of my voice. Excellent. Richard, I'd like you to work with Cassandra on this. It sounds like she's identified a significant opportunity that could benefit the entire department. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations, but I barely heard the words. All I could focus on was the expression on Richard's face as we filed out of the conference room. For the first time in 18 months, Richard Blackstone looked genuinely rattled. The aftermath was swift and deeply satisfying. Within a week, Elena Martinez had scheduled a private meeting with me to discuss expanding my responsibilities and leveraging my analytical strengths. The business plan I submitted for the healthcare and tech market expansion was approved with a budget allocation and a request to lead the initiative. Richard, meanwhile, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to support a project developed by someone he'd spent months trying to marginalize. But the real vindication came 3 weeks later, during our regular team meeting. Before we dive into individual project updates, Richard began, his voice lacking its usual confident authority, I want to acknowledge some excellent strategic work that's been happening on our team. He paused, looking like he was swallowing something particularly unpleasant. Cassandra's market analysis and business development proposal has been approved by executive leadership, and she'll be leading our expansion into the healthcare and tech sectors. This represents a significant opportunity for the department, and I want everyone to know that we'll be supporting this initiative fully. The words were right, but they sounded like they'd been extracted under torture. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize that sometimes the best strategic insights come from taking a fresh perspective on familiar data. Cassandra's work demonstrates the value of thorough analysis and innovative thinking. Jennifer, Mike, and David exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that something significant had shifted in the team dynamics. After the meeting, as we were gathering our materials to leave, Richard approached my desk. Cassandra, could we speak privately for a moment? We walked to his office, and for the first time since I'd started working there, he closed the door behind us with what looked like genuine humility rather than intimidation. I owe you an apology, he said without sitting down. I've been unfair in my assessment of your capabilities, and I realize that my management approach hasn't been supportive of your professional development. I remained standing as well, maintaining eye contact but saying nothing. After 18 months of his condescending speeches, I was curious to hear what this one would sound like. I think I may have let some personal biases influence my evaluation of your work, and that's on me. Your presentation to the executive team was exceptional, and it's clear that you have strategic abilities that I failed to recognize. He ran a hand through his prematurely gray hair, looking more human than I'd ever seen him. I'd like to discuss how we can restructure your role to better utilize your analytical strengths and give you more opportunities to contribute at a strategic level. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had spent months trying to convince me I needed to be restructured into a support role was now offering to restructure me upward. I appreciate the acknowledgement, Richard, I said carefully. What kind of restructuring are you thinking about? Senior strategic analyst, with a focus on market research and business development. Direct reporting relationship to Elena, with dotted line coordination with me for departmental projects. And of course, a salary adjustment that reflects the expanded responsibilities. It was everything I'd wanted when I first took the job, offered by the man who had spent 18 months trying to convince me I wasn't capable of earning it. That sounds like it could work, I replied, keeping my tone professional. I'll need to review the specific responsibilities and reporting structure, but I'm interested in discussing it further. As I turned to leave his office, he spoke again. Cassandra. Paused at the door. For what it's worth, you handled that presentation brilliantly. I should have recognized your potential much earlier. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Thank you, Richard. I guess sometimes it just takes the right opportunity to demonstrate what someone is capable of. 6 months later, the healthcare and tech market expansion had exceeded our revenue projections by 40%. I'd been promoted to senior strategic analyst with a $15,000 salary increase and my own office. More importantly, I'd rebuilt my confidence and proven to myself that Richard's assessment of my abilities had been dead wrong. Richard, to his credit, kept his word about being more supportive. Our working relationship became professional and respectful, though it never became warm. He seemed to have learned that undermining talented team members wasn't a sustainable management strategy. But the most satisfying moment came during our year-end performance reviews. Cassandra, Elena said as we sat in her office reviewing my annual evaluation, I have to tell you that your turnaround this year has been remarkable. When Richard first suggested that you might be better suited for a support role, I was concerned that we might lose a valuable team member. She paused, looking at me with the kind of direct eye contact that meant she was about to say something significant. I'm glad we decided to focus on development rather than role changes. You've become one of our strongest strategic contributors, and the executive team has specifically mentioned your work as an example of the kind of thinking that will drive our growth in the coming year. As I walked back to my office that afternoon, I reflected on everything that had happened. Richard had tried to convince me that I wasn't smart enough, strategic enough, sophisticated enough for the role I'd been hired to do. He'd used every psychological manipulation in the corporate playbook to make me doubt my abilities and accept a lesser position. But in the end, the results spoke for themselves. The clients valued my insights. The executive team recognized my potential. The market expansion I'd developed was exceeding expectations. I wasn't the problem. Richard's management style was the problem. The beautiful thing about workplace bullies like Richard is that they're usually so focused on maintaining their own image that they forget other people are capable of strategic thinking too. They assume that if they can make you feel small enough, you'll stay small forever. What they don't realize is that sometimes, pushing someone down just gives them a better angle to see exactly how to knock you off balance. I never set out to humiliate Richard or destroy his career. I just wanted to do good work and be recognized for my contributions. But when he made it clear that he was determined to undermine me regardless of my performance, he forced me to become strategic about more than just marketing analysis. The day I walked into that executive presentation, I wasn't just presenting market research. I was presenting evidence that Richard's assessment of my abilities was fundamentally flawed. I was demonstrating that his management style was holding back talented team members rather than developing them. Most importantly, I was proving to myself that I was exactly as capable as I'd believed when I first took the job. Richard learned an important lesson about underestimating people. The executive team learned that strategic talent can emerge from unexpected places. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply succeeding so spectacularly that everyone can see exactly how wrong your critics were. These days, when I mentor new employees who are struggling with difficult managers, I always tell them the same thing. Document everything, develop your skills, and wait for your moment. Because if you're truly good at what you do, eventually someone in a position of authority will notice. The truth is, you can't fake competence forever. And you can't hide incompetence indefinitely either. Eventually, everyone's real capabilities become visible to the people who matter. I just made sure that when my moment came, I was prepared to prove exactly what I was capable of accomplishing. And watching Richard's face during that presentation, that was just a beautiful bonus.